Imagine the silence of a home where a father reaches out his hand, and the son doesn't take it, where every attempt at conversation turns into a monologue, where birthdays are remembered through absence and unread messages hurt more than insults. If this has happened to you, then stop. Don't insist, don't come closer, at least not in the way you've been doing. Because according to Freud, what appears to be rejection is not always about you. Sometimes it's about what the other person sees in you, or rather what they project onto you. And while you approach with love, they might be feeling guilt, shame, or wounds they cannot name. So they react by pulling away, a defense reflex against their own past. There is a silent pain in being ignored by someone you once cradled in your arms, a child who doesn't return calls, doesn't ask how you are, doesn't show up, even when everything in you screams for presence. But the answer to that is not in humiliating yourself or demanding explanations. The human mind, Freud said, is a minefield of unresolved traumas, distorted memories, and repressed emotions. And often, it's the parent, the father, or the mother who becomes the emotional scapegoat for debts life never allowed them to collect from anyone else. You become a symbol of authority, of abandonment, of pressure. Even without wanting to, even without deserving it, it's cruel. Because while you carry love, they carry resentment. While you offer presence, they feel burdened. But this is not resolved by direct confrontation. Freud warned us, the unconscious does not respond to logic, but to emotional repetition. And every time you insist, approach with anxiety, explain yourself, or try to fix things, you are unknowingly reinforcing the conflict. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The silence grows. The distance becomes habit, and what once was a bridge turns into an abyss. So if your child avoids you, stop. Not because you gave up on them, but because maybe insisting in the wrong way is the surest way to lose them forever. Pulling back with dignity is, at times, the most powerful gesture. It is the silence that breaks the cycle. It is the emptiness that allows the other to notice what they're missing. Freud said that sometimes the best thing you can do is step off the stage so the other can notice your absence. And that's not manipulation, it's emotional wisdom. It's giving space for love to breathe rather than suffocate. And if that silence persists, don't despair. They may not seek you out now, but at some point, maybe too late, maybe just in time, they will feel it. Because true bonds don't disappear, they just fall asleep. And sometimes all they need is enough distance to awaken without fear. Love, when it is mature, doesn't scream, it waits. And when you stop chasing, the deepest healing begins, not theirs, but yours. Because in the end, the greatest reunion you can have is not with your child. It's with yourself. There is a kind of pain that doesn't bleed. It doesn't scream, doesn't show itself to others, but it slowly corrodes the one who carries it. It's the pain of being ignored by the very person you once held in your arms. When an adult child pulls away, avoids contact, refuses dialogue, or returns silence in response to every attempt at closeness. A parent's heart breaks in a place that doesn't always have a name, but carries history. Freud taught us that nothing in the human psyche happens by chance. Every distance hides an unconscious reason, an unhealed wound, a reflection of something that may not have even started with you. The mind, Freud said, is like an underground stage where memories, traumas, and fantasies play out, even when we believe we are living in the present. When a child avoids their parents' gaze, they may unknowingly be rejecting the internal image they hold of them, an image built not just from reality, but from childhood perceptions, cultural weight, emotional absence, and unspoken silences. And shouting over these inner scripts won't work. They do not respond to logic. They respond to symbols, behaviors, and emotional repetition. That's why no matter how desperate you are to restore the bond, approaching with anxiety might be the very act that drives them further away. Every child carries within them a version of their parents, and it rarely matches the full truth. That version is shaped by infantile fears, primitive defenses, and emotional interpretations. Freud called this projection, the process of assigning to others what we cannot consciously admit in ourselves. And that's the danger. You offer love, but they feel invaded. You speak with kindness, but they hear accusation. You reach for reconciliation, and they react as if you're launching an attack. And the cycle repeats, reinforcing the distorted image their unconscious refuses to release. The only way to break this cycle, paradoxically, is not to insist, but to withdraw. Freud understood the therapeutic power of absence, strategic silence, the kind of withdrawal that heals more than presence ever could. When you step back, you allow the other person to feel the emotional void, and only when that absence becomes more painful than your presence ever was, can they begin to revise the inner narrative. This process isn't quick or guaranteed, but it's the only way that honors both your emotional boundaries and theirs. To withdraw is not to give up. It's to trust in the timing of the unconscious. It's to release the role of the fixer, the pleaser, the desperate parent, and to embrace a deeper identity, the one who has done enough and now chooses to protect their own peace. Because as Freud reminded us, what is not transformed is transmitted, and this is true for both parent and child. If the relationship is bleeding, the first step is not to push harder, but to stop the emotional dance entirely. Only then can a new rhythm be born. Sometimes the very moment you decide to stop chasing is when healing begins, not necessarily in the relationship, but within yourself. Freud often emphasized the internal landscape, the terrain where unconscious desires, repressed wounds, and family entanglements collide. When your child avoids you, it may stir an ancient pain within, the terror of being unwanted, unseen, or not enough. And that pain doesn't start with your child. It begins much earlier, in the shadows of your own childhood. Perhaps you too once longed for affection that never came, for validation that never arrived. And now life repeats itself, but with different faces. The mind has a strange way of reenacting unresolved stories. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to relive a painful past in hopes of rewriting its ending. But without awareness, all we do is recreate the same wound over and over. You reach for your child, not only as a parent, but as someone trying to redeem the inner child within yourself. But when that child turns away, you're not just losing them. You're reliving a grief that's much older. This is why the pain feels so sharp, so unfair, so overwhelming. It's layered, it's ancestral, and yet it's precisely here, in this unbearable clarity, that transformation begins. Freud didn't promise comfort. He promised truth. And truth is rarely painless, but it's the only ground solid enough to build healing upon. If you can recognize that your suffering is not only about this child, but about a history that lives in your body, then you can begin to disentangle, to love without begging, to care without being consumed, to be present without disappearing into someone else's silence. It takes courage to step out of the old dance, but the only way to break the cycle is to become conscious of it. As Freud said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This moment, painful as it is also a threshold. You can step back into the shadows of resentment, guilt, and reactivity, or you can step forward into self-respect, stillness, and inner clarity. Not because it guarantees your child will return, but because it guarantees that you will no longer betray yourself in the process. Letting go doesn't mean you stop loving. It means you stop abandoning yourself in the name of love. It means you recognize that affection demanded is no longer affection. It becomes emotional debt. And no child, no matter how wounded, can repay what they don't yet understand. Your task now is not to pull them closer. It is to become so whole within yourself that even their silence cannot dismantle your peace. There's a quiet power in refusing to be emotionally blackmailed by distance. Freud would argue that guilt is often the shadow side of love, especially in family structures. Parents who gave everything begin to feel owed. Children who feel inadequate begin to avoid. And what grows between them is not just space, but tension, thick with unresolved feelings. When you demand closeness from someone who isn't ready, what you often get is resentment disguised as politeness, or worse, coldness that punishes your hope. But what if love didn't have to be earned back? What if the real proof of love wasn't in constant reassurance, but in the willingness to step back without bitterness. This is what Freud might call a sublimation, taking painful drives and transforming them into something higher. Instead of pleading, you cultivate presence. Instead of confronting, you practice detachment. Not the kind that closes the heart, but the kind that protects it from being repeatedly pierced. Your child's avoidance is not your failure. It is a message. Not about your worth, but about the emotional architecture they are still trying to build or escape from. You are not the blueprint of their wounds, even if you remind them of it. And this distinction is vital. If you begin to personalize their silence, you fall into the trap of overcompensating, which, according to Freud, only reinforces their unconscious resistance. Sometimes, not reacting is the most loving thing you can do, because it gives space for the unsaid to echo, and echoing is how realizations are born. We live in a culture that glorifies fixing, controlling, repairing, but relationships, especially with adult children, do not thrive on pressure. They thrive on safety. And safety begins when one side no longer tries to manipulate the pace of the other's healing. By stepping back, you give your child the freedom to choose, and that choice, if ever made, will mean far more than anything you could have forced. Freud would say that love, to remain love, must always involve freedom. Otherwise, it becomes a disguised form of domination. And if that freedom leads to continued distance, then let it. Grieve, yes, but do not collapse. Do not turn their silence into your self-definition. You are more than a parent. You are a human being with stories, needs, and dignity that do not depend on being wanted. The path now is inward, to sit with the discomfort, to let the echoes settle, and to emerge not as a version of yourself waiting to be chosen, but as someone who has finally chosen themselves. Silence in relationships is not always absence. Sometimes it is language. Freud believed that symptoms speak when words fail, and in many families, the unspoken becomes the most powerful force. What isn't addressed begins to shape dynamics from beneath. A child may stop calling not because they don't care, but because the weight of connection feels heavier than the silence. And that weight is often made of things no one dares to name: unhealed disappointments, emotional enmeshment, subtle expectations, ancestral roles. This is why confrontation often backfires. You go in asking, "Why don't you call me?" But what they hear is, "Why aren't you the child I wanted you to be?" And the defense rises. Walls are reinforced. Love retreats. Because confrontation without awareness isn't healing, it's accusation in disguise. Freud warned us, beneath every conflict lies something unspoken, something older. If you truly want connection, you must first be willing to meet them where they are, not where you need them to be. Sometimes that means no longer being the emotional rescuer, no longer offering yourself as a sponge for their chaos, no longer believing that love means suffering in silence. Freud's theory of transference explains how people project unresolved emotions from the past onto figures in the present, and in families this is constant. If your child sees you not as who you are, but as who they felt you were, their behavior will follow that inner image. And you cannot change their view by force. Only time and absence and your quiet transformation can soften the distortion. So let that be your revolution, a radical return to self. Instead of overextending, practice holding. Instead of begging, breathe. Instead of reacting, reflect. This is not passivity, it is mastery. Freud saw maturity not as the absence of pain, but as the capacity to hold it without being consumed. And you, right now, are being called to become larger than the wound, to become the space where healing, theirs or yours, might one day unfold. And maybe they will come back. Maybe they won't. But either way, you will have crossed a threshold. You will have ended the inner war between giving everything and losing yourself. You will have learned to live with longing, without letting it dictate your worth. Because in the end, the deepest reconciliation is not with another person. It is with the part of you that finally understands you are always enough. There is a moment in every journey where grief becomes teacher, not the loud grief of funerals and farewells, but the quiet, invisible grief of disconnection. Freud understood grief not only as the mourning of death, but as the mourning of ideals, of illusions, of expectations that never came true. You grieve the version of your child you thought would exist. You grieve the phone calls that never come, the holidays that feel like punishment, the milestones you're not invited to witness. And that grief, if not faced, can mutate into something darker. Resentment disguised as loyalty, or bitterness masquerading as love. But there is another way. A way Freud called working through, the slow, painful process of metabolizing the loss without clinging to denial or fantasy. You begin to see things not as you wish they were, but as they are. And in that clarity, you stop waiting for apologies, explanations, or perfect timing. You start creating a life that is no longer built on the hope that someone else will finally see you. You become the witness of your own pain, and eventually, its healer. You reclaim your agency in a relationship where you once felt powerless. Freud often described emotional growth as the ability to tolerate reality without fleeing into illusion. And for many parents, the hardest reality to accept is that love does not always return in the form it was given. You may have poured your heart into that child, sacrificed, protected, stayed up countless nights. But love, especially when filtered through the unconscious, is not always reciprocal. Not because it wasn't real, but because what you gave may have been filtered through what they couldn't yet receive. That's not your failure. That's the complexity of the human psyche. And so, you begin to redefine love, not as control, not as constant presence, but as a state of being that includes healthy boundaries, emotional sovereignty, and the courage to feel sadness without becoming it. You let yourself cry, not because you are weak, but because your tears are proof that your heart is still alive. You mourn, and then slowly you emerge, lighter, not empty, but no longer burdened by illusions, more whole than you've ever been, not because someone came back, but because you stopped abandoning yourself. In this new space, you no longer chase, you no longer shrink, you simply exist, fully, peacefully, and without apology. Freud believed that self-awareness was the key to liberation, and by facing the pain instead of escaping it, you open the door to something sacred, freedom. Not the freedom of being chosen by others, but the freedom of finally choosing yourself. There is something magnetic about silence. It invites projection, interpretation, fear. When a child goes silent, the parent's mind becomes a theater of worst-case scenarios. Did I say something wrong? Did I fail them somehow? And Freud would remind us, this internal noise is not necessarily about the present moment. It is the echo of the past, the surfacing of unresolved guilt, or perhaps the return of early experiences where love felt conditional, fragile, easily withdrawn. Our need for connection often conceals our fear of abandonment. And that fear, if left unconscious, drives us to overreach, to become over-available, to ignore our own limits, to tolerate neglect in the name of love. But when you begin to recognize that your urgency to fix the relationship may stem from your own emotional history, you reclaim power. Freud saw healing not as the removal of pain, but as the expansion of consciousness. When you know where your pain comes from, it stops owning you. Perhaps deep down you fear that if you stop reaching out, your child will forget you. But the paradox is that true presence begins when performance ends, when you no longer call to get a response, but to express what feels true, when you no longer write messages hoping to provoke guilt, but to offer clarity, and when those gestures are no longer returned, you know how to step back without collapsing. You stop tying your identity to someone else's reception. This is what Freud called ego strength, the ability to hold the tension between desire and reality. The strongest love is not the one that demands. It's the one that endures without losing itself. It's the love that says, I am here, but I will not abandon myself to be near you. This kind of presence often does more than confrontation ever could, because it creates a safe space, free of pressure, expectation, or emotional ransom. And in that space, the child is no longer trapped in the role of disappointing you. They are free to come back or not, and either way, you are whole. This is how you stop the inheritance of emotional wounds. Freud warned us that unresolved pain travels through generations like invisible smoke, but the moment you choose not to repeat the pattern, not to beg, not to guilt, not to self-sacrifice, you become the interruption. You become the one who rewrites the story, not by force but by freedom. As time passes, the nature of the silence may change. In the beginning, it's piercing. It echoes through your bones. Later, it becomes background noise, until one day, it transforms into space. And in that space, something unexpected happens: clarity. Freud believed that time does not heal all wounds, but it does reveal them. And with enough silence, the unconscious begins to speak. Not always with words, sometimes with dreams, shifts in mood, or subtle realizations that bloom slowly in the soul. You may wake one morning and realize that your child's distance no longer defines your worth, that their silence is a mirror, but not a prophecy, that you can choose to walk differently now, no longer bending to win them back, no longer blaming yourself for their absence, just walking, upright, conscious, whole. This is not detachment. This is maturity. The maturity Freud spoke of when he described the goal of analysis: to transform unbearable neurosis into manageable sadness, and from there, into freedom. It's in this space that you begin to live again, not as someone waiting for reconciliation, but as someone building a life of meaning regardless of it. You find joy in unexpected places. You build connections that nourish rather than drain. You begin to trust yourself again, to know what's yours to carry and what is not. And in doing so, you stop feeding the unconscious contracts that once ruled your life. You are no longer reenacting the past. You are writing something new. And if someday your child returns, you will receive them not with the hunger of the abandoned, but with the calm of the healed. You will not rush to explain your pain, nor will you need to, because you will know that your story no longer depends on their understanding. Freud would say, being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. And in this moment, your honesty is your peace. You are not perfect, but you are present. And that is enough. You did not fail. You transformed. You stopped the cycle. You gave love without turning it into a leash. And in a world starving for control, that is a radical act. That is healing. There is a certain kind of strength that doesn't make noise. It's the strength of someone who has been wounded, but no longer bleeds on those who did the cutting. Freud knew that real transformation isn't dramatic. It's subtle, quiet, internal. It's the parent who chooses peace over pursuit, dignity over desperation. It's the one who, when left in silence, listens not to their fear, but to their truth. In the end, this journey was never just about your child. It was about you, about how you respond to absence, to rejection, to love withheld. It was about discovering whether you could be your own source of worth, even when the person you gave everything to turns away. And now you know, you can. You can stand, breathe, rebuild. You can mourn and live. Not as a half-parent, not as a discarded presence, but as a whole human being. And if you are still in the middle of it, still hurting, still confused, know this: healing is not a straight line. Sometimes you will cry. Sometimes you will want to write, call, beg. That is okay. You are not failing. You are feeling. Freud reminded us that emotion is not weakness, and it is data. It is the soul's way of pointing you toward what matters. And what matters now is not controlling another's path. It is honoring your own. You have walked through fire, not the fire of drama, but of slow private heartbreak, and you emerged. That alone makes you worthy. Your love did not go to waste. Even if it wasn't received the way you hoped, it existed. It shaped the world. And one day, perhaps, the one who distanced themselves will feel its echo. But whether they do or not, you are free. Free to live. Free to let go. Free to choose yourself, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of rebirth. Because when love is no longer a plea, but a presence, you have arrived. There are wounds that cannot be healed with answers, only with presence. And perhaps this is the deepest truth revealed by this journey, that the absence of someone we love does not have to mean the absence of ourselves. We spend our lives trying to decode the silences of others, yet we forget to listen to our own. The pain a child causes when they pull away is real, it is valid, but it can also be a portal, a call to revisit who we were, what we gave, what we silenced in ourselves. And more than anything, a moment to reclaim what no absence should ever take away: wholeness. The unconscious, as Freud taught us, does not distinguish between past and present. It repeats. It reenacts. And when we are not aware of this, we turn our children into actors in an old play, hoping they will perform a scene they were never meant to fulfill. But when we accept this, not as defeat, but as liberation, something within us begins to soften. Hope stops being a burden and becomes a possibility. Not because it depends on the other, but because it is born from our own decision to move forward. Not begging for affection, but cultivating peace. Not controlling outcomes, but recovering dignity. Often, the reconciliation we long for will not take place externally. It will take place within. When we stop looking for someone to blame and begin to embrace who we truly are, human beings shaped by longing, memories, and wounds that were never linear. And when we understand that love no longer needs to be a transaction, it transforms into presence. A presence that doesn't invade, doesn't demand, doesn't bend, but stays. Quietly, steadily, maturely. Capable of existing even without applause, even without return. And perhaps that is the true legacy Freud left us. The ability to transform, not by changing others, but by integrating ourselves. The power to realize that others are not mirrors, they are boundaries. And to love truly is to know where they end and where we begin. Because the moment we stop chasing acceptance, we begin to accept ourselves. And that changes everything. That is when we stop being prisoners of love withheld and become guardians of our own worth. If your child avoids you, perhaps they are not running from you but from the pain reflected in you. And if that's the case, may you find the strength not to chase, but to remain, not to wait, but to live, with clarity, with dignity, with peace in your soul. If this message stirred something in you like this video, subscribe to the channel and share your story in the comments. Your experience may help someone else find meaning in theirs. Together, we create a space where silence can finally be heard and transformed.